Okay. I want to get back and pick up where I left off in exploring this idea of egology and ecology as we integrate some of these ideas of interpersonal neurobiology of community and connection. And when we left off, I had distinguished between ecology as a natural state and egology as the more human imposed state, if you will, and how that egology has tricked us into thinking that the natural world, we're not integrally integrated and interdependent with the natural world because of the way we have created social institutions and social ecologies that really are governed more by a mindset of egology, where humans are at the top of a hierarchy that manages and uses resources, as opposed to being a part of ecology that is part of and interdependent with. And I would say bringing in a way to think about this has to do with power. Like in interpersonal neurobiology, we're talking about the flow of energy and information between and within that allows the emergence of, we talk about mind, but we also talk about the emergence of our experience and our environments over time. And I think it's to think about this challenge we have of removing ourselves from ecology because of mindsets of egology really represent a very fundamental rupture that really demands a repair. And braiding sweetgrass, again, this is so informed, the way I wanted to approach this presentation. She talks about that very fundamentally what we have is a relationship rupture with our natural world. And I think this comes into how humans have domesticated power. So we all have power. It is a power within. It is a fire in our belly, right? That motivates us to seek, to connect, to be part of communities. And I think at a fundamental natural level, this is intended to be bidirectional and a power between, a power with others and our natural world. And that it is in the bidirectional exchange of power, energy, information that we are interdependent parts of a universe, of an ecology that has existed well before, and I mean well, before humans ever came on the scene, right? However, humans, in their sense of dominion over, have this sense of power over. They've taken that fire of the belly, the power within that we all possess, and have established social institutions and egologies, as opposed to ecologies, of power over, the hierarchy, the vertical, and have created systems of power under, where there's a subordination of others and natural beings that get in the way of what fundamentally is the exchange of energy and information that is reflected in the psychological sense of community. We can talk about it at the human level, but I think also reflects our more natural ecologies of the exchange of energy and information, the flow of life between, that is better represented when we think about really basic things like we breathe and our breath is picked up by our natural environment, our green things around us that photosynthesize, taking in our breath and using that in their own needs to then produce the air that we breathe. And you can see in this very simple example, this interdependence with our natural world that we have come to kind of ignore and think that we can control in the management of our resources. And in this practice of moving to egology has created what sweetgrass and braiding sweetgrass refers to sometimes as commodity economies. So moving from ecologies to economies, where these resources are exchanged as goods, they are domesticated as goods to be managed, resources to not to be shared and to be grateful for, but rather to be exchanged. And it's created a certain ecology, economy, right, where we've really used resources to gain wealth, as opposed to being interdependent. Um, and so I think when we talk about community and connection and IPNB, we can bring in a new sensibility of moving society back into the natural world and finding this shared intersection here of resources of the natural world and community, where community does fundamentally, if we look at all those domains of the psychological sense of community, actually do include all of, perhaps most of the fundamental elements, let's say, of being able to recognize ourselves in an interdependence with other humans, but also with the natural world, and in ways that we could begin to understand gratitude, where society gets so far away, because it gets so big and so structured in, this mindset of egology, humans over, we fail to recognize the reciprocity, and we can build these vertical ways of being over rather than with. And so it's the intersection of this gratitude for resources from the natural world and the way our human gifts can contribute to the natural world in a reciprocal way, and being grateful for this interdependence. And I think IPNB brings in these ideas of integration, of biodiversity, mutuality, and interdependence that can be applied here if we're conscious of moving back into an ecology intentionally. So we talk about attention and intention. So we become more attentive to the natural world and what it contributes. We become more attentive to our gifts, to the natural environment, and to each other, that is based on reciprocity, shared resources as gift, as Sweetgrass introduces, like gifts are not something that can be bought, but rather are freely shared and freely received with gratitude. So I think that IPNB again sits at this window of invitation, where we can step into a sense of community and connection. And so going back to the literature around community psychology, we can think about community as place. And I just kind of had these questions for reflection of, where have you and your people lived? Consider the localities, the nationalities of your origins, your neighborhoods, your schools, your built and your natural environments. What would those look like if you think about community as place, and how far would they reach? I know for me, community does reach back to my immigrant story as German immigrants, in particular, a little bit more vaguely as Irish immigrants. But community as place is an interesting idea. Again, Braiding Sweetgrass suggests that we're almost all immigrants in this country now. With the displacement, in part because of the displacement and genocide of indigenous people, we've become a nation of immigrants. We have an immigrant story, for better or worse. And the other exception would be African Americans, who I would say are not immigrants, but were brought forcibly to this land. So people with that history. But we still have community as place. But Sweetgrass suggests that immigrants have lost a sense of their place story because they came where they weren't fully involved in becoming indigenous to place. They came as colonizers to make their place story the story of their new land. So rather than finding place in mutuality and interdependence, they imposed. And I think it contributes to this idea of egology, putting themselves over, managing the land, domesticating the natural properties of that. So getting back to that sense of community as place may well be going back to the origins of the immigrant story. What were the stories of place before your people immigrated? or emigrated, I guess, technically. So then community as shared identity or belonging. Who have you lived with and who have you lived among? And you might expand this to that natural world. Consider families, organizations, citizenship, natural ecologies that form and inform you. How would you talk about a shared identity or belonging as community and connection? Community as values. What matters to you in the world and what has informed this sense of value? Community as knowledge. What questions, ideas, or beliefs have shaped you? And what are the sources of this knowing? And I would expand that even to say, what are the limits to our knowing and how do we get back into that dynamic flow of knowing and away from the knowns, to be able to touch the knowns, but be able to move back into the dynamics of knowing, to plateaus that bring us into footsteps towards possibility, but also keep us grounded in the plane of possibility, to be able to know that there exists many knowns and ways of knowing that we can tap into as we begin to find our own rituals of belonging as in a sense of connection and community. And then community as action for change. And that's what your capstone is all about, is how has IPNB inspired you to take action in your personal, professional, or spiritual lives? And how does it bring you back in this sort of iterative process into these other questions of community as place, community as shared identity, community as belonging, community as values, community as knowledge and ways of knowing, and then community as action? Where is that for you? And the capstones, of course, have been just beautifully articulated and lovely to be able to see where people went with how IPNB has informed this. So this brings up this idea of deep ecologies of a community. And deep ecologies is an informed way of knowing that allows us to really dig deeper into ecology of the natural world and go beyond surface ecologies that can be, how do you plant a tree, and more into what is our interdependence with the natural world, where this rooted system of fungus and other communities below our understanding actually are the same patterns. They talk about biomimicry, these same patterns that we see in our brain, reaching out, making connections that actually enhance the flow of energy and information in a process of reciprocity. How do we bring ourselves back into a deeper sense of community by going into deep ecologies of our belonging and our interdependence with both the human and natural world? And to go back then to IPNB, I would suggest that the 9 domains of integration are a really beautiful mechanism for being able to bring in our attention so that we can transform that into, or move that into, intention that can transform our world in meaningful ways, and our communities in ways that enhance belonging and connection. So consciousness, the 1 domain of integration, differentiates the known from the knowing. The known. I would say, because we live in social constructions of egology, that our knowns become facts that represent natural law, or replace natural law. We want to get back to the plane of possibility that where natural law actually does reside. And some would say there is no natural truth, no natural law. And I'm of the mind, for right or wrong, I don't know, but I'm of the mind that there is natural law, that there are ways of being that we are so disconnected from that all we can ever see is how they have been socially constructed. So just keeping in mind that our knowns and our ways of knowing are very much social constructions, and we need to keep dipping deeper into the deep ecology through deep listening to others and their intentions and meaning to start to get back to a true sense of consciousness. We talk about bilateral integration, integrates holistic and focused ways of knowing, representing that our lateralized brains have redundancy, but they also have specialization, where the right brain does hold context, has relationships and connections in a very different way than the left brain processes language and categories. Both are helpful. Both help us understand and be in the world in different ways. But we do, kind of the mind of Ian McGilchrist, I do have the mind that we need to lead with the right, with the relational connectedness before we start putting things into boxes. Right? And then the vertical integration of interoception, the awareness of subcortical input and our body input, bringing in also interoception, neuroception, getting to know the internal state through different ways of reflecting and conscious awareness, but bringing that in and then integrating it with the external world in ways that allow for vertical integration. Bringing in memory in integration, implicit and explicit integration, really exercising that hippocampus to allow things that are implicitly held for both good and for bad, bringing that into conscious awareness and allowing that to be integrated into a felt sense of self within our ecology. Now, some would challenge the idea, do we really have a self? And I would say probably what we know of self and how we define self is a social construction, and that probably is not the self. But the idea, I think I'm of the mind that we do have an internal state that gets integrated, for instance, like within the cingulate. Gets integrated in our brainstem, this sense of external experience and internal experience, and that those are memories that create patterns of connection within our world, and moving that integration in memory into a coherence. And I think this is facilitated through narrative, the narrative integration, use of language, how we make sense and meaning through storytelling. And again, this is such a fundamental sense of connection with others. Other domains then are state integration, self-experience, connection, nature, distinct self. So the idea of differentiation and linkage as the self that can be known is a relational self. It probably really serves, to my reason anyway, that self can't exist without the relationship of other, and yet that the internal states that one can experience we may call self. And I know in my work in violence that one of the issues is a failed integration of states and a failure of being able to transition through states. And I think things like meditation really help to build skills around transitional states, recognizing that I am not my state, but that I can move through and integrate states of being, and that they aren't me, but they contribute to a sense of self. And the idea of kind of separating this idea of states from my definition of self. We're going to do a whole thing on that too. The interpersonal integration, interpersonal, honoring difference, cultivating compassion that we've kind of talked a little bit about. And then temporal, integrated sense of time and time travel. And this in particular, I think is interesting, is time is definitely a social construction. The idea that we're seeing a star is that is, like time, happened an awfully long time ago, but we're seeing it in this moment that we call time, the present moment. Is really the reflection of billions of years ago or whatever that is. So our sense of time just held lightly as a temporal sense of integration, right? And ourselves in past, present, and future, and how that integrates into a sense of being. And that we only really do have the moment, whatever that is. It's not the Big Ben time or the time on our Apple Watch, but it is actually our sense of this moment of experience that I have. But because we're humans, we have a sense of what has transpired in the past and what will potentially could become our future. So being able to imagine, all a part of temporal integration, and then transpiration, identity integration, sensation, perspective, agency integration, and that brings us, of course, to the wheel of awareness. The wheel of awareness is Dan Siegel's practice, and I don't know if you've dissected it a little bit in your own mind, but it is an interesting practice, but it's really it's really the integration of several different mindfulness practices. The awareness of the five senses, what is coming in, what am I seeing, or how am I processing hearing, like what is that attending to the five senses, what's coming in from the external world, coupled with the mindfulness practice in the polar side of that, the mental activities, what he calls the seventh sense, is mindful practice of the mental activities. So the internal sense, the thoughts and the feelings, right, integrated across. So that sense of mindfulness practice, becoming aware of what I'm taking in from the outside world and what is coming up from me within my internal world in mentalizations. And then the other, up in the right, top right quadrant, is the body scan practice, that is the physical sense of my both internal and external milieu. So you will feel like the sensations, you do your body scan internally, but also this is also informed by our external sensations. And as you know, the wheel of awareness is talking about that hub out there, where it's the known of this, and we separate that by becoming aware that these are transient, that all this mental activity and thoughts and feelings, as well as the information coming in through our senses, as well as the states of our body, being influenced by the external temperature and what we're taking in there, and the internal tensions within our body and our muscles, like all of this is not an absolute thing that exists, but rather an experience of something that's transient. And so we move into this awareness hub to let those things go so that they can move their course. Like, we don't try to capture a wave on the sand. We don't try to capture a cloud, because they move on. And being able to get into that more fluid state of being, then this bottom left quadrant, which sometimes what I've seen in other presentations, not Dan Siegel's website, puts that on the bottom right. I'm not sure I understand this all of this well enough to understand why it's sometimes there and sometimes not. But we're talking about the five senses, and we're talking about the sixth sense, and we're talking about the seventh sense, and then we're talking about eighth sense. That's the meta meditation, a loving kindness meditation, where we go from the sense of self and then broaden our ideas out to the living world. And I think it's an interesting practice for being able to get back into the sense of awareness of ourselves as interdependent in ecologies that we're not trying to grab hold of, where we're not attaching ourselves to the sensory information or to our mentalizations or to our body manifestations of these things, but rather holding them lightly so things move, and then we move out into an interdependent consciousness, awareness of our interdependence in our broader ecologies, our environments of adaptedness, right? It really takes us to a more humble place. And I'm always worried about consciousness because it's become so humanized, like it's the higher state of being. But I would suggest what we're supposed to be called to is into an awareness of ourselves as beyond our body, right? And then that awareness, as we have the sensibility of ourselves interdependent in these larger ecologies, that then we can move our intentions to ways that we can bring our gifts, to be able to identify our gifts and the ways that we reciprocate the gifts of other members of our ecology and our living world. So I'm going to stop there and just kind of leave you with those thoughts about how IPNB better informs how we can become more humbly aware of our place in our ecologies that are deeply rooted in natural ways of being that are beyond our consciousness often, and certainly, knowledge that have operated way before humans came on the scene, and to situate ourselves humbly within this awareness of our interdependence, our vulnerability, our living organism, the nature of our being in this world, and to be able to identify the gifts that we receive, the gifts that we bring, our responsibilities that are part of that awareness, and then the reciprocity that contributes back to this interdependence. I'll leave you with that, and we'll pick up next week.